perspective and the context. But before I introduce our keynote speaker tonight, I have a personal story to share that I experienced during the so-called Cultural Revolution in China. Since most of you are too young to know anything about it, so what it was like and anything to remember that alone. I was born. This year was 1968, still very much in the height of the infamous political movement. I started my middle school year in 1968. I was 13. I was 13 years old. Can you imagine that? Youngsters normally started attending middle school when they are in the age of 12. But the education system was completely destroyed for more than a year. So there was no school enrollment process. So by the time I was admitted to the middle school, I was a 7th grader in the elementary school, something never before has been possible. Up to the middle school, most youngsters, 13 years old, had no idea about the political life they're about to endure. But that soon had changed. We were made to attend denouncement sessions, 批斗会, in other words, right? Students of all classes were gathered and sat in the schoolyard and watched the 5 black classes, the 黑五类, being denounced and criticized. I was rather short at the time, so I sat about the 4th row from the platform. Several men and a woman, presumably the teachers of the school, were taken to the platform. The platform was about this high. And their arms were bent backwards so their heads were bowed low, almost to their knees. They called this 喷气式飞机, the jets. All of them had a heavy wooden poster hanging on their neck. On the poster, you read, so-and-so, the counter-revolution, and so on, and so on, and so on. So the atmosphere was hot and intense, and slogans were shouted from the loudspeakers, and the little red books were raised to the air, and it was just, everybody just had to follow. And then all of a sudden, my classmates sat in the front row, jumped to the stage, the platform, and start to beat one of the men being criticized. They beat him heavily and severely. The man couldn't stand the beating and fell to the ground. Well, the fists and arms, legs and feet flying around the poor man, I felt blood surge to my head, and my heart was about to break out of my chest. But the beating just went on and on and on. I spent the next 50 years trying to erase the horror from my memory, but unable. Until about 3 months ago, my perspective started to change. I learned that in 20 of those 50 years, an American female scholar and historian had devoted all her energy to a research project that documented the same horror, if not worse, about 7 Chinese artists during the Cultural Revolution. Then I realized what I wanted to forget was what she reminded me to remember. And furthermore, as she noted in her book, The Art of Resistance, the book of her 20 years of endurance, that I quote, during the Cultural Revolution, creativity did not die out. That the experience of being criticized and persecuted opened their eyes to injustices and freed them from their usual obligation. And that they deliberately craft ambiguous images so the hostile parties would not detect politically sensitive content. And once complete, paintings take on a life of their own. How these men suffered both physically and mentally was tragic and injustice. It put humanity in shame, and it put history in shame. But tragedy inspires creativity, and from injustice it bears truth, goodness, and beauty. In other words, these men's work were like lotus flowers emerging from a pit of mud. 就所谓出污泥而不染, so true, so pure, and so free. As she further noted, in that some battled persecution with a feisty spirit, if not outwardly, then inwardly. They saved art, and art saved them. So tonight, I have the distinct honor and privilege to invite her to the podium, Dr. Shelley Drake Hawks. She will share perhaps a fraction of her 20 years of research, but since we are gathered for a conference about calligraphy, she's kind to offer the extended topic from her research, interrelations between paintings and calligraphy in the art of 潘天寿、石鲁、李可染和李苦琛. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Dr. Shelley Hawks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Wow.
Thank you.
Oh. Thank you very much. That was probably the most beautiful introduction I've ever gotten. Thank you very much, Dr. Maurice Chi. This is really a privilege for me to address this calligraphy conference. I'm very much humbled to do it. So I hope that I can offer some fresh perspectives. Could we please have the slides, please?
Warm up.
Oh, it's warming up. Okay, here it goes. Good. Okay, for my title today, I chose a phrase by the artist Shelley, one of the painters I'll be speaking about. 书画同乐同源. Calligraphy and painting, same joy, same source. So, as you know, in China's scholar tradition, calligraphy and painting are extremely closely related. They are sister arts, always blended, never wholly independent of one another. Please, could you change the slide? So I've pictured here the desk of Li Keran at the Li Keran Painting Academy in Beijing. And I wanted to start by setting some themes. If we talk about calligraphy and painting giving rise to the same joy, I think it means self-discovery, self-expression, understanding who you really are in the context of thousands of years of tradition. And I also should add that calligraphy makes amazing gifts between teachers and students, for example. Now the second part, calligraphy and painting derive from the same source. I think that source can be thought of in two ways. In the materials, brush and ink, and also in terms of the human body, because the calligraphy itself is an extension of one's arm. The brush is like the bone, and the ink is like the blood and the tears, especially when we look at Shelley's calligraphy, so emotional. And secondly, the source, the spiritual source. That could be the ancestors, nature, the life energy. Next slide, please. So here is one of Shirley's calligraphy scrolls expressing his belief that calligraphy and painting are closely related. As a result of his suffering, his calligraphy became very expressive, and art is what healed him. The characters are very dynamic. They look like they might spin off the page. Sometimes Shirley's calligraphy is very thick like this, and sometimes it's extremely thin, as we shall see. Next slide, please. So first, a little background. Shirley was a proud Communist Party member, the vice chairman of the Xi'an Art Association. He was very independent-minded, and he fell into trouble in 1964 after his 1959 painting of Mao in a landscape was criticized, and he refused to revise the painting. The severe pressure on him led him to develop schizophrenia. During the Cultural Revolution, he was severely beaten and detained in solitary confinement. However, after 1971, he was returned home and he began to secretly paint works like this one. And here we see a duck hiding behind the pale pink branches. And the calligraphy is very faint and thin. This quiet duck, with no eyes visible, recognizes the beginning of spring and hopes for warm weather. Next slide, please. Shirley aged dramatically as a result of his treatment during the Cultural Revolution. On the left is his self-portrait in 1955, and on the right is what he looked like in 1977. He was very eccentric, but he could still paint very imaginatively. In fact, he's been called China's Van Gogh because mental illness expanded his boldness and deepened his artistic vision. Next slide, please. So this painting of an old horse is very interesting. He described it in the inscription as a horse without a saddle, suggesting that it cannot be forced to obey. This illustrates how closely Shirley's painting resembles calligraphy. The horse's body looks like it could be a single Chinese character. The first character of the inscription, Lao, meaning old, looks like a horse's body. It even has a horse's tail. And if we look at the horse itself, we notice the skill with which Shirley gives us the feeling of horse hair, the tail, and that mysterious empty spot where the saddle is absent. The empty place seems to have a swirling energy about it. This horse is calligraphy and painting at the same time. Next slide. Even his name seal participates in this blending of writing and image. His name, Shirley, is inside the seal. This is painted on with his brush. His carved name chops were stolen from him during the Cultural Revolution, and out of principle, he never used those name chops again. By painting them, he had more freedom to turn them into images. And here he chooses revolutionary red to paint the horse shape with his name inside. Next slide. So sometimes Shirley used thick and thin calligraphy in the same picture. Note the thick, wet calligraphy, Hanjiang, cold river, contrasting with the skinny characters, Qiu Yue, autumn moon. Here he has painted a plum flower growing from the side of the paper rather than planted in corrupt soil. This suggests his aloofness. According to his inscription, suffering has deepened his understanding of himself. Next slide. Now Shirley's lean calligraphy during the Cultural Revolution reminds me of a 1947 sculpture by Alberto Giacometti after the Holocaust and World War II. Giacometti's pencil-thin, life-size sculptures powerfully express injury to humanity, the consequence of an extremely dehumanizing situation. Next slide. So this is the first image in a long scroll that Shelley painted in 1971. He had just returned from the Niopang, the ox pen prison. We see a healthy red flower with an insect looking down at it. Raindrops are on its antennae. The flower could represent an artist, art itself, a flourishing world, a virtuous person, or a heroic revolutionary. Next slide. In the next image on this long scroll, the insect is chewing on the blossoms, making them look thin and unhealthy. Next slide. And in the last image of the scroll, the insect has devoured the flower. A red flying insect points a spear at the blackened flower as it lies on the ground. Shelley's calligraphy looks like scratches on a wall. Next slide. So as you can imagine, I had some difficulty reading those inscriptions, but I was able, with the help of some friends, to get some parts of it. It's a very moving outcry of resistance against the Cultural Revolution's persecution of creative people. His main messages: the kind ones exist forever. Pay respect to the great inventors. They forever guard the universe. He lists people he admires: Zhuangzi, Confucius, Buddha. Scientists and artists like Edison, Newton, Franklin, Darwin, Da Vinci, Hugo, and statesmen like Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Next slide. Shelley traveled to India and Egypt in the mid-1950s as a member of a Communist Party delegation. He did travel sketches there. But after his experience during the Cultural Revolution, he transformed his old sketches to reflect his anger. He added many Chinese characters, filling up practically all the blank space. Next slide. And on the rock under the man's sword, Shelley wrote the names of two artists he admired: Tolstoy, or Leo Tolstoy, and Tagore, the poet. So he did this during the early 1970s when such foreign authors were banned. Next slide. So here is one final example of Shelley's calligraphy and painting. Note how they blend to form a powerful expression. Shelley asserts that wealth and rank mean nothing to him. The peony, mudan, typically thought of as an imperial flower, symbolizes rank and wealth. See how the peony is painted very faint pink to suggest his distance from it. And yet the writing is very bold and dynamic. It gives the impression of shouting. Next slide. Shelley's daughter, Sheridan, is also a fantastic painter. She knew her father during his final years. She now paints abstract art. She calls her series the Golden Lotus series. She said that she does not want to copy her father's style, yet she has inherited something spiritual from him. Next slide, please. So my second painter is Pan Tian Shou. Here he is with a detail from his last painting of a plum tree encircled in snow under the moonlight. This 1966 painting was a protest against stifling policies that required ink painters to only paint bright red, optimistic subjects. This is a very large painting, 6 feet tall, done with his finger and his fingernail. The painting was denounced during the Cultural Revolution and used as evidence to accuse Pan of counter-revolutionary crimes. You can still see the black X through the painting. It's now displayed on the campus of the China National Art Academy in Hangzhou. Next slide, please. So as president of China's National Art Academy, from 1959 to 1966, Pan established a curriculum for teaching Chinese painting, calligraphy, and seal engraving. Before then, the school had mostly taught Western methods. Pan was a bold innovator in his own painting, too. Even as a young man, he had enormous ambition and self-confidence. He felt compelled to walk his own road and reach new heights. And he believed that painting's value was in establishing oneself. Next. So Pan developed a very interesting signature on his paintings, a long vertical chain of descriptive words. The show, meaning that's part of his name, from Le Poteau Peak, and that was a reference to his childhood school, which he remembered very nostalgically. So in paintings like this one, he used the 6 characters of his signature in an inventive way to balance the design. The painting would look quite different without that signature line of calligraphy. Next slide. Now, in this example of Pan's calligraphy, note how he defies the rules. His calligraphy does not appear in orderly columns, and the size of the characters varies a lot. He created a very large and dramatic character, he, meaning when. This is a scroll of Mao's poem, Mount Liupan. So he's asking this question, when will there be positive change? And the last part of Chairman Mao's name, Mao Zedong, is also elongated for emphasis. It was common at this time to inscribe Mao's poetry as a tribute to Mao and his ideas. Next slide. Now, in this painting, Pan introduces an element of surprise. There's so much blank space between his name and the cat. It's a 5.5 foot tall scroll. Next slide, please. You might think of the cat as looking like calligraphy. The large round eyes, V-shaped ears, rounded back, and the tail pointing sharply back to the cat's head. Looks like a brush stroke. Next slide. And this 12-foot wide painting of a water buffalo in a summer pond also has an expansive sense of space, giving the suggestion of water. And look how Pan has echoed the shape of the water buffalo body in the rock forms. Next slide. And here is a detail of it. This is one of my favorite paintings by Pan. The water buffalo has a strong psychological presence, showing life experience and a kindness in his eyes. Farmers counted on the water buffalo to assist with farming, and most of the time the buffalo would cooperate. Here the animal is cooling off in warm weather. I think it was rather daring of Pan to portray the buffalo this way during the early 1960s. The buffalo is alone, but it has a ring in its nose and a rope wrapped around one horn. To me, this suggests that the buffalo has a hidden master. Look at how Pan has created so many textures using strokes and washes. We sense the hardness of its horns and its wet, ragged fur. Next slide. So this 1963 Red Lotus is one of Pan's most famous paintings. The relationship between the lotus and the calligraphy is very interesting. The inscription does not seem very political, but I may make an argument tonight that there is a suggestion of a political message in it. In the second line, Pan implies that the flower in gorgeous light is fluttering red, pian pian hong. So one gets the sense that the flower's petals are fluttering like a revolutionary flag. Also, take a look at the character zhong, with its vertical line echoing the stem of the lotus flower. It seems meaningful that zhong makes us think of Zhongguo, or China. Could there be some meaning in this inscription? Possibly. A few years before, in a well-publicized speech, Pan Tianshou had called for an end to suffocating art policies. He said if such policies continued, the so-called 100 Flowers movement might end up producing only a single flower. Pan had courageously defended his art school during the Great Leap Forward, when party policy pressed him to turn the school into a factory. Making this political interpretation hinges on that one character, zhong, in the inscription, the vertical line making it stand out and echo the lotus stem. This represents a fascinating case of the interrelationship between poetry, calligraphy, and painting. Next slide. Now, Pan was treated very cruelly during the Cultural Revolution. On a cold January day, the 72-year-old former art school president was awakened by his former student and told he was to go to his home village of Ninghai for a struggle meeting. He was denounced and forced to march through the snowy streets. During the train ride home, he picked up a cigarette wrapper and a pencil stub off the floor, and he wrote a poem. "This cage does not feel narrow to me. My mind is as wide as heaven and earth." After this incident, Pan's hair turned completely white, and he died a year later. Immense talent was wasted. However, now Pan is honored by the Chinese government, and his paintings are now in the museum on the campus of the school where he was once president. Next slide. Pan Tianshou's son, Pan Gongkai, also became a top educator. Until recently, he was president of the Central Academy of Fine Arts. His recent art series, Withered Lotus Cast in Iron, seems to have a spiritual connection to his father's work. He told me that the lotus in his imagination represents Chinese culture, fragile and threatened, and yet still very tough. Next slide. Li Keran. So Li Keran was from a very poor family in the south of China. His father was a chef and died when he was very young, and his mother was illiterate. But she enthusiastically supported his dream to become a great artist. Li worked hard all his life to achieve greatness. Next slide. I chose this painting for the cover of my book. Li Keran painted the water buffalo and the herd boy many times over the course of his life. In Buddhist painting, taming the buffalo means taming one's animal nature and working towards enlightenment. In the 20th century, Chairman Mao said, intellectuals must be willing oxen, humbly serving the common people at all times. For Li to portray the buffalo as stubborn was quite rare. Typically, the two were in harmony. Li's inscription explains that the buffalo's nature is mostly tame. It's only stubborn sometimes. According to Li Keran's student, Sun Meilan, Li painted this stubborn buffalo in 1962 to express his independence in the face of strong criticism of his painting. He was pressed to stop painting in his personal style and show more bright optimism in his work. Next slide. Li enjoyed making the buffalo look like calligraphy, and as we'll see, his calligraphy looks very much like a buffalo. Next slide. So this is the calligraphy which he had in his studio, and he named his studio Learn from the Buffalo Studio. So he saw himself in the buffalo's nature, and note the swishing tail, the upturned horns, and the furry round forms. Next slide. And here I am with Li Keran's student, Sun Meilan, and with his daughter, Li Ju, and this is at the Li Keran Painting Academy in Beijing, and his son, Li Gang. And Sun Meilan prepared two calligraphies for me that are on the piano here. Afterwards, there's a few calligraphies I'd like to show that were gifts to me that are very interesting. Next slide, please. So Li Keran is mostly known for his landscapes, many with waterfalls. And I was very interested to learn that his waterfalls are not painted white. Their refreshing, luminous feeling is created when the paper is left blank. And he calls this use of emptiness white writing, as though it were a kind of calligraphy. Next slide, please. So Li Keran did not talk very much, especially in his later years, and some thought he was very timid. But actually, he was very brave in his art. During the Cultural Revolution, he was not allowed to paint, so he devoted himself to studying rubbings from ancient stone monuments to strengthen his calligraphy. He had been inspired as a young man by Kang Youwei and his call to study the ancient rubbings. And Li Keran's calligraphy developed a new power as a result of this intensive study during the Cultural Revolution. And this is his motto: what is precious is courage, what is necessary is soul. Next slide, please. And his calligraphy is also very whimsical, and it really does suggest the water buffalo swishing his tail, as we can see by this character, hua, meaning painting. Next slide. So Li Kuchan, the fourth painter we'll talk about, was a colleague of Li Keran at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. Both Lis were students of Chi Bai-shi. Li Kuchan was very fit and athletic. Here he is practicing his martial arts kick in his final years. He was also an amateur performer of Peking opera. He incorporated some of the stylized gestures of Peking opera into his painting classes, showing students how to paint in a strong theatrical manner, using the brush almost like a sword, as an extension of his arm and body. Next slide, please. So in 1919, Li Kuchan and Mao Zedong, had both studied at a training school in Beijing designed to prepare youth to go abroad to France and work in factories. But neither of them were granted visas, so neither of them went. However, many years later, when Li Kuchan was fired from his teaching job, this is in 1950, after the Art Academy had been changed hands after the communist liberation. And Li appealed to his old classmate, and surprisingly, Mao helped him get his job back. Li had written his appeal in cursive calligraphy on a very long scroll, and Mao was an expert in calligraphy, and he was very impressed. So he sent his secretary to restore Li Kuchan's teaching job. However, Mao did not protect Li Kuchan during the Cultural Revolution. Next slide. So Li Kuchan, he specialized in painting eagles and other birds. And during the Cultural Revolution, he was put in the Niupeng, the ox pen jail, with other members of the faculty at the Central Art Academy in Beijing. And after he was allowed out, he was still not supposed to paint. However, he painted these small paintings secretly at night, and he hid them during the day. The art historian Sun Meilan has described his paintings as the eagles as looking like sadly thinking giants prevented from flying. And the other painting here shows two small birds protecting each other from the rain. Next slide. Now this small painting from the 1960s of a pair of fish demonstrates Li Kuchan's vigorous cursive style of calligraphy. In the inscription, Li points out that a fish's physique is difficult to capture in painting because it's constantly moving. The rapidly swishing fish bodies in our imagination resemble the rhythm of his calligraphy. Next slide. In 1981, after Deng Xiaoping came to power, Li Kuchan completed this huge painting of lotus blossoms and herons, the largest painting of his life. He was 84 years old, and he wanted to express his joy that traditional Chinese culture had come into favor again. And on my website, I have a link to a 4-part video called Lotus and the Red Star. And in that part 1, you can watch footage of Li Kuchan painting this painting. Next slide, please. Now here, Li Kuchan has left a trace of his spirit in these two characters, Xin and Hua, heart painting. The words are free, powerful, and joyful. His son, Li Yan, was cleaning out papers after his father's death, and he found it, and he added the inscription on the side of it as a tribute to his father. Next slide. And I was fortunate to interview Li Kuchan's son, Li Yan, on 3 different trips, 1995, 2004, and 2016. And each time he got older, and so did I. And he really looks a lot like his father now. And in this 2016 photo, I'm joined by my good friend and colleague, Professor Jinxing Li, who's in the audience tonight. She assisted me with translation during my trip. And I've also have a calligraphy by Li Yan that is on the piano here that you can look at after the presentation. Next slide, please. So when I was in Hong Kong, in 1995, and then more recently in Florida after he retired. I met Wan Qing Li and his wife, Zhang Qing Chun. Wan Qing Li is known as an art historian. He's also a painter. And it was Wan Qing Li and his wife who received this painting of a cabbage and a plum blossom branch from Li Kuchan as a wedding present in 1977. So 1977 was still really at the very tail end of the Cultural Revolution. Wan said that he had never seen a painting like this before. I'd never seen a plum blossom that was not vivid, revolutionary red in color. Next slide, please. Now the inscription reads, 实在觉梅花易感清新之气. Eating cabbage, chewing plum blossoms benefits one's mood and renews vital energy. Wan Qing Li had been a student during the Cultural Revolution, but he did not become a militant. He was suspected of counter-revolutionary thinking and was jailed together with the old art professors. So through that experience, Wan became close with many famous artists and was treated like a son by Li Kuchan and some others. So by painting these two symbols of moral integrity, the white cabbage and the plum blossom, Li Kuchan suggested that both he and Wan had been innocent of the accused crimes. And also he was urging Wan and his wife to pursue virtue and plain living in the future. Next slide. Now here I am with the fifth artist, Huang Yongyu. And I met him in 1995 when he was in Hong Kong. He's now in his 90s living in China. Huang became internationally famous for this winking owl painting. It almost earned him the death penalty during the Cultural Revolution. Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, confiscated the painting and called it evidence of Huang's sarcasm, his winking at socialism. And Huang repainted it. The original was lost, and here the inscription insists that it is a beneficial bird, not a corrupt bird. Next slide. Now, Huang Yongyu had also been in the Oxpen jail with Wan Qing Li, the one who received the cabbage painting I just showed you. So when Huang Yongyu moved to Hong Kong, he became reconnected with his old friend Wan Qing Li, because they had been in the jail together. So one night they were talking together, and Wan Qing Li, as an art historian teaching at the University of Hong Kong, was complaining. He was feeling exhausted. And so all of a sudden, Huang Yongyu started painting out this scroll with advice for Wan about how to live. And he called it the 5 Moods Picture. And Huang said that one must change up his attitude. He says, don't live your life the same way over and over. He said, you can face life squarely, you can close one eye, you can close both eyes, you can turn your back, or you can play dead. Next slide, please. So Huang's calligraphy is very playful and humorous, like his painting. And here he surrounds the owls with his writing. The birds themselves look like calligraphy. And here Huang wrote, "Life does not have to be so serious." I have a letter from Huang Yongyu to me on display on the piano too, that you can look at after the presentation. So when I interviewed Wan Qing Li, the recipient of this painting in 2016, he said that he was really touched by Huang Yongyu's concern for him. However, he said he could not take Huang's approach to life. He said he had a whole different kind of personality. Okay, next slide, please. Now, when I visited Wan Qingli in Florida, he honored me with a painting to celebrate the completion of my book project. My book was originally called Painting by Candlelight. So here he has painted the burning candle, the paint brushes, and the ink with a peaceful dove flying overhead. And I want to thank him for his confidence in me. He was really one of the early people who took a risk to really tell me, the real truth about some things. At first, when I started my research, it was very difficult to get people to talk to me about the secret art during the Cultural Revolution, but he always was very forthright. So I'd like to dedicate this lecture to Wan Qingli and many others who kept and continue to keep Chinese culture thriving and alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So I will take questions if anyone would like to.
Question.
Yes.
How did you get it all started?
I worked at, he asked, the question was, how did I get started? I worked at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in the Asiatic collection. And actually, even before that, I was hired by a businessman who had brought oil paintings from China and wanted to sell them in New York. So that happened in 1987, and I met a lot of artists. Through that show, I met Tom Wu, who was curator at the Museum of Fine Arts, and he really introduced me to a lot of Chinese paintings. In that collection, there's a very interesting landscape album by Cheng Shifa, and that painting was told, Wu Tong, the curator, told me that it had been painted secretly during the Cultural Revolution and that had been accused of having counter-revolutionary meaning. So I had gotten interested in and wondering, was there any kind of secret meaning in it? And I wasn't even aware until then that there had been really high-quality painting going on even during those years. So that's how I started. But when I first went over in 1995 to speak with Cheng Shifa, it wasn't very easy to talk to him. He was so polite to me and so interesting, but he really didn't want to talk about politics. So it was only the younger people who were more direct and open who helped me get started. Yes.
When the book published, do you intend to have someone translate into Chinese?
I would love to have the book translated into Chinese. It was just published in 2017 by University of Washington Press.
Looking for volunteers.
Anybody else?
So I'm the calligraphy teacher, so might be I'm just thinking one thing. You are learning about the painter's calligraphy, right?
Yes.
So did you find out something like just regular calligrapher and the painter calligrapher? What's the difference over there? Maybe that's the point you're going to find out later.
I think I need to ask for your advice, because actually I'm very humble about this subject because I was really more interested in their painting, but I realized that these artists were very serious about their calligraphy and really saw painting and calligraphy as interrelated. So that's the angle I brought forth tonight, but I would be very interested in hearing your point of view.
I have a question in general. When a piece of artwork is created, then it has its life of its own. And it's
Yes.
subject to interpretation of all kinds.
Yes.
So in this case, for example, when many of these pictures you show here, people can give a completely different interpretation.
Yes.
So if there's any conflict like this, do you think there might be some other alternative interpretation?
So, President Lee, that's a fantastic question, and I thought about it so much during the course of my research. One thing, I had to make sure that the painting was not a forgery, right? So that was always important for me to make connections with the artist's family. And because a few times I actually took a painting out of an auction catalog, and then when I went and showed it to Shirlu's son, or I showed it to Li Ku-chan's son, they said, oh, that's a forgery. So that really would have been discredited me if I had talked about that. Then I also tried to stick in my book with the interpretations that were validated by either the artist's student or the artist's son or daughter, someone that really knew the artist personally. That interpretation I offered tonight of Pantian Shou's Red Lotus, that was entirely mine, and I don't know, if it makes any sense. So that's, as you said, once the painting is in the public realm, it's open. It's open to interpretation, but there still is a responsibility to be as careful as one can. Be accurate about the inscription, accurate about the date. Try to learn as much as you can about the actual personal context of that work. Okay.
I know it is difficult to imagine that you would be interested in this topic because by introducing those pictures and writing and drawing, I feel suffocate. I don't. That the art's supposed to be appreciative of happiness, and all of a sudden the art is not representing happiness anymore. I can see Mr. Parn's work when you say the water buffalo is gentle, the eye of gentle. My understanding is it's got so nervous, it's almost like crazy, and the cat is the same. The eyes, it could get me a nightmare. But,
interesting. Yeah.
Most of the paintings are so cramped and so difficult almost difficult to watch.
Yeah.
Why would you, as a Westerner, why would you interested in the art like that?
Wow. I don't have that same feeling about the art, but I do understand where you're coming from because, certainly if we look at Shirlu's revised paintings, they were crammed full of, inscriptions, and they do reflect his mental instability. But I really, my early approach was as a historian, and I wanted to make sense of human nature in that context of the Cultural Revolution. And I had such admiration for artists, because artists reach deep into the culture, and artists are resilient and in the face of terrible times. So I think that there is actually a real beauty to what they accomplished during that time. But it's a very interesting comment you made. I also think maybe a Westerner would be more open to art that has a lot of anxiety in it, because something like we have Van Gogh and we have Edvard Munch, and we have all those kinds of artists that we appreciate. So I wouldn't say that I would be expecting all art to make me feel, pleasant. Okay. Thank you.
How inspiring that is. That was. Still is.